Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we remind ourselves that philosophy has always been about the public good, and we've got to do our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. I'm joined today by Dr. Kim Maslin, who is a professor of politics at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, a wonderful institution that I actually had the privilege of being a member of the faculty there for 4 years a while ago. And so Kim is joining us today to talk and think about what it means to be free, how we understand our relations to each other in the context of social society. And she is the author of an excellent new book called The Experiential Ontology of Hannah Arendt. And it is a book that is perfect from front to back, except for a really bad blurb on the reader ID. Everything else is fantastic. So Kim, thank you so much for joining us and being with us today.
Oh, thank you.
So maybe we can start off by just saying something about what is your general take as a political theorist on the discussion that we're seeing right now about the restriction of freedom, the restriction of liberty, in light of what many would see as it's not about liberty, it's about a social agreement and social solidarity. How do you see those playing off of each other?
So I was really curious because I was perusing Facebook earlier in the week and I saw this. I thought it was a pretty innocent post that you had made that was basically like, hey, shouldn't we be wearing face masks? And I was kind of struck by the response, which seemed to take over the post at that point, which I suspect is not all that different than some of the experiences we've been having just living life in the last couple weeks, right? Doesn't it seem reasonable that we should maybe put these face masks on when we go out? And the response was not even so much about the face mask decision itself, but Aaron, you should stop talking and start thinking for yourself, which I thought was so fascinating because I do think you're hearing that request from both the right and the left these days, right? More independent thinking. We need to, in some ways, separate ourselves from whatever it is that's making our thinking not independent and carve out this, what is it that makes my thinking my own? And it just struck me as such a fascinating request because at first it separates sort of thinking and what Arendt would call action. Arendt would hope that our thinking is kind of a prerequisite for the action, right? Whereas this person is almost positing that you have to choose one or the other. And then the other thing that I thought was so curious, given that both the right and the left would like us to think for ourselves and view that as part of democracy, what does that actually require? What would make your thinking your own? And so if you think about, I was thinking about Heidegger, right? The early Heidegger seems to think that there would be some possibility of a universalist thinking if we can transcend our uniqueness, whereas Arendt would want you to sort of dive into that uniqueness, but then invite the other into your sort of self-reflection and your contemplation. And the question becomes then, how do you do that? If I were being real honest, I haven't put a whole lot of time and thought into whether or not I should wear a mask. I have one in my car, I have one in my purse, I flop it on every time I go out, and have I really contemplated that? I guarantee you I've spent more time figuring out what the measurements of a proper mask should be, what are the proper materials, do I need the elastic, how long does it need to be? That could be classic calculative thinking, right? There's not a lot of reflection there. At the same time, I don't necessarily perceive there to be any kind of conflict between that which is in my self-interest and that which is in the public good, right? The mask does both of those things. It serves my self-interest in the sense of protecting me a little. It serves my self-interest in the sense that I am less likely to wake up in 5 days and find out that I'm responsible for infecting 50 people before I knew I was sick. And it also helps me to protect others. So I don't find a conflict there, at least in my experience, but it is an interesting call. Part of what Arendt would want us to do is invite into that contemplation, right? Both those that are vulnerable and those who are feeling that their rights have been violated and make that part of our self-reflection.
One of the things that's so interesting to me about this discourse and has played out on Facebook, I think, for lots of people, is in the attempt to think about what it is we're doing and why it is we are doing it, it's almost as if any appeal to reasons, maybe we would say that there's an epistemic distinction that's being made about what even counts as good reasons. And yet, I don't think, and this is the hard part and where I get a lot of grief from people on the left with me, I don't think most people on the right are not concerned about reason giving. I think it's that what counts as reasons for them look fundamentally different than what I consider the right kinds of reasons we should be offering right now. And so it ends up looking like we're in two different epistemic spaces, but yet it might just be, no, we're appealing to two different, evidential sources. And that does seem to yield a very different way of going forward.
And yet, isn't there a possibility that masks actually solve this for us, right? That if the reasoning that you want to appeal to is we need to return to something that at least resembles normalcy, even if normalcy itself is going to be elusive for a while, and protecting others needs to be our chief sort of grounding as we move forward, isn't it possible that masks solve both of those problems? Not in an absolute sense. Is risk going to go away? Obviously, no, but it may allow us to resume some kind of aspects of normalcy, at least enough that we don't feel completely isolated, while at the same time, if we have a critical mass or a sufficient number that are doing it, you can eliminate, up to 90% of the spread of this virus. So in a way, I feel like no matter which of those you use as your chief grounding series of rationales, there is maybe a tool that we could plausibly agree to as a way forward. And I do think there's some that are rejecting all reason giving whatsoever.
Maybe then one way to think about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is I've been struck by what I consider a kind of egoism that is being displayed at the heart of a kind of libertarian notion of social life, where because society is grounded in the freedom of the individual, therefore the good that should motivate those enacted freedoms must be what is good for me. But of course, that doesn't necessarily follow, right? We can be libertarian at the level of we want small government and you're not Nazikian about minimal governmental intervention, and yet say the whole point of a society is some sort of restricted freedoms in the name of social protection.
The aim of small government still has to be grounded in some kind of notion of the public good, right? And then the question becomes, how many things fit in that notion of the public good? And so we think of national defense as being a clear and easy answer of something that has to be present in the public good, otherwise we cannot protect ourselves. We think of roads and bridges and some of this basic infrastructure as being absolutely necessary to that public good, otherwise we can't get goods from one place to another, and then we run out of toilet paper. And so I think the area that's actually always been interesting, two areas maybe that have always been interesting and challenging for us in this country are education and healthcare. And we accept certain parts of that as crucial to the public good, and that's why you have free education through the 12th grade, and it's also why you have free clinics that offer vaccines at a reasonably low price. But anytime you try and push outside of some of that, those basic limits, what is it that belongs in the public good, you get some pushback, as Barack Obama found in 2010 with healthcare. We absolutely had Medicaid and Medicare already, and yet the notion of universal health insurance created an enormous amount of pushback that we're still finding. And so I think education and healthcare present us with some really unique challenges with that question of what constitutes the public good and therefore should fit into our notion of small government.
How do you make sense of that? If I were to think of what are the lowest hanging fruits at the level of social engagement and the concern for myself being also anchored in a concern for others, it would be I benefit from having healthy neighbors because the healthier they are, the more likely I am not to get sick. And I benefit from having educated or non-ignorant neighbors because the more likely I am not to have to pay the costs of their bad decision making. In a weird sense, I remain perplexed by the fact that it seems to be you're either in favor of freedom or you're in favor of some sort of absence of freedom in the name of, what's called socialism. It seems to me that this is just an utter confusion because those who would say it's all about freedom, I'm not wearing a mask, you can't make me, are also the people who it seems are forgetting that the social arrangement is what's providing them the possibility of continued freedoms, right?
The opportunity to say that to begin with. Yes.
Yeah. And vice versa. Those who say, no, it's all about the community, still are saying, but that community needs to thrive in particular ways so that the individuals can pursue things like liberty and happiness in the way that they understand it. It's that, the argument for social minimums is not in the name of a communitarian good. It's in the name of individuals having the ability to pursue what they consider to be the good. It's more likely they can do that when they're not having to worry about paying rent or providing healthcare for their kids, right? It seems like both sides are fundamentally agreed on the things that matter, freedom and social engagement. And yet it's like we've allowed a wedge to be introduced that splits these apart, and yet neither side can make any sense without the tacit approval of the value set of the other.
I do think we're a little bit reluctant to accept that before you can make choices that are really empowering and free, you might have to have a certain basic level of either healthiness or education, right? It seems like that premise is maybe something we've been a little bit slow to accept. The other thing I think we might periodically need reminding of is that when and in what ways your neighbor's lack of healthiness or lack of access to education actually becomes a problem for you. We probably would almost like to go through life thinking that that's not something that's necessarily going to affect me, because if we do allow it to filter into how we think about it's going to affect me, then we have a lot more to worry about in the world. And so, one of the things that I think this virus demonstrates to us is just how interdependent we are, not just in our communities, but also globally.
Well, I mean, you live in Arkansas, I live in South Carolina. These are not exactly, they're not bastions of progressive social policies. And yet it's interesting because the South is also widely known, or at least narrated, for its neighborliness, right? This kind of, concern for each other, and we'd help each other, unlike the, kind of stereotypical New Yorker attitude of, get out of my way, taxi, I'm driving kind of a thing. And yet it's almost like we want that kind of neighborliness to be a product exclusively of one's own willed decision. And I wonder if that's not, to go back to where we started, I wonder if that's not anchored in something like a worry about what influences the views that we hold. In the South, there is often this sense that if you hold progressive views, you therefore hold them because you've been listening to the wrong sorts of media, the wrong sorts of influences, been reading the wrong books, God forbid you've been going to those liberal colleges like Furman and Hendricks and having professors like us who have been corrupting you, etc. And when we do this, it's interesting because it's kind of you might say conservative version of what Heidegger would call the they, or what Kierkegaard would call the public or the mass, what Nietzsche warns about with the herd, right? So we've got a long series of philosophical warnings about giving in to some sort of groupthink that then does make the only kind of thinking we can do end up being just nothing but calculation. And so in a weird way, the conservative opposition to progressive views seems to be anchored in something like a worry about they thinking. So in both directions, it seems like we've got worries about not thinking for ourselves.
I think that's absolutely right. And it may be that who the they is simply different. If I had some hope for the more conservative tradition, I think it would be that there is periodically a very profound sense of civic duty. I think recently you can hear this from John McCain. And I think if there's an opportunity to get back to something like that can be positive and very community oriented and maybe even very hospitable, it might be through resuscitating something like the notion of civic duty. I mean, John McCain listed his obligations as God, country, and family in that order. And I do think that if the maybe extremist rhetoric has a chance to pull back to something that is still conservative, but that is conservative in a community-oriented way, the route to that might be through a John McCain.
Even, for example, the narrative of patriotism, shorn of its nationalist rhetoric, it's a community conception of civic duty, right? That we have our freedom because there is this space where it is guaranteed in particular ways.
And that means we have certain obligations. Right? And so those obligations can be paying taxes, they can be military service, they can be, I don't know, Pledge of Allegiance to the flag in the morning at school, or they can be putting on your mask and doing the best that you can for your neighbor.
Right. And that's a thing that I think Hannah Arendt in particular offers some critical resources for, because her conception of the relation between thought and action was, I think, grounded in, look, it's not that we will all come down on the same spot relative to what social life should look like, what public policy is going to be the best way forward. She allowed an enormous range of, I think, plurality to play out there. But yet she did think that the only way that that kind of social action is going to be responsible is if we are fully invested in the difficult task of thinking well. And that's the thing I think right now that I worry about just as much on the right and the left, right? Is this sort of cheerleading echo chamber mode in which we no longer have to pay attention to the critic because the critic is obviously irrational or immoral.
And I think you're absolutely right to worry. I think most of us are probably worried that even in our own individual lives, are we really doing maybe her justice or that approach justice in taking a multifaceted approach to our social media lives at the moment? The answer is probably no.
It reminds me of something Simone de Beauvoir says in Ethics of Ambiguity, where she's worried about the fact that we think that we're obviously acting the right way, or that our thinking we've already done that, and so now we can move forward in confidence and certainty. And she says, look, you better be careful and ask yourself daily, and her question was, am I working for the liberation of all people? If my actions aren't, then I should have a moral and social check on what it is that my thinking has allowed me to put into practice, right? But yet we act as if that crowd, that they who is there supporting, clicking the likes and saying yes and wonderful and resharing, if that we almost think as if, well, I must be doing it the right way because look at the applause, right? Or vice versa, I must be doing it the right way because the people with whom I disagree are real angry at me, right? Rather than saying, but am I working for the liberation of all people?
Well, I unfriend.
Yeah, yes, that's exactly right. Well, and it was weird. Just the other day on social media, I blocked the first person I've ever blocked. What I had to figure out was, what is the threshold where that becomes necessary? Philosophers and political scientists probably should be good at this. So we should be the ones who have the longest patience for that kind of conversation.
I mean, in some ways, it's fun to be in these states where you absolutely have to engage it because it is so omnipresent, not only in your classroom, but also in your daily life. And so some of those conversations are remarkably satisfying, even if you are well aware that you haven't changed anyone's mind. But there has been reason giving on both sides that makes sense, and that even brings for us, right, evidence to the table that we had not previously considered. And so I do appreciate the conversations around masks or this virus that really call on us to articulate why this is different than your average flu season, right? Those, I think, are very productive conversations. But the other thing we could do better with is, what kind of accommodations could actually work? Like, if you accept that churches and meeting in one place as a congregation is essential, aren't there ways that we could do that outside? I mean, almost every church has to have a parking lot, right? That would diminish the risk considerably if you just agreed to meet outside. Why are we not thinking more carefully about some of those avenues, right? Like, I mean, I think the restaurants and takeout is a really good example. I don't know about you, but some of my friends who are small business owners are saying, you know what, the drive-through business is really not that bad. Given the crew that I have to have on, I can stay afloat this way.
What are the things that, if you could speak to an audience of, all Americans, say, and you said, look, here's the basic idea, or two ideas that you need to know about political science that will help us move forward in innovative ways, embracing these challenges. What are those things?
I think first and foremost, most of our polarization comes not from polarization of individuals, but comes from polarizing rhetoric, which then pushes individuals into some kind of dichotomy. I think most of the issues, even the ones that we find most divisive, if you actually sit down and try to have a conversation with people that you respect and are willing to devote some time to, I think most of the time what we find is that we are not polarized. We are, most of us, somewhere in the middle. And so the distribution, I think, of the population looks more like a bell curve than it does like these polarized samples. But because we have two parties which conceptualize their ambitions as fundamentally contrary to one another, what we get is a rhetoric at the level of party leadership that pushes us towards dichotomy. I think if you take something like abortion, right, which has been probably our most divisive issue going back 50 years, what you find, I think, is that there are relatively few people who would actually say, sure, free abortions anywhere, anytime, at any point. There are also relatively few people who would say no abortions ever under any circumstances. In fact, we could have a very productive conversation about what conditions might actually be reasonable and what health limits we might want to actually ensure do continue to exist. I actually think the same thing could be said for this virus. And when we first, in different colleges, right, made the decision to go online, I left and walked out of an American political thought class, and one of my final words to them was, maybe this is actually the moment when we come back together and realize that regardless of our partisan affiliation, right now, we have a hell of a lot more in common than we do separating us. 2 weeks later, that looks like a really foolish statement. But at the time, I actually felt pretty good about it. Here we are, we're more interdependent than we think. And regardless of where you live, and regardless of what your career choice, and regardless of who you voted for in the last election, we're pretty equally vulnerable right now. And I don't know if I'm asymptomatic. I don't know if you're asymptomatic. And I don't know how this thing is getting spread in the grocery store. I don't know if I should go out and pick up the package that's just been delivered to my house, right? Maybe we actually have a lot in common. And the kinds of things that are going to keep us all safe might not actually be all that different. So, I mean, my takeaway is what's polarizing us is more rhetorical and more partisan strategy than it is actually part of who we are.
It's like a lived model of why they thinking is so dangerous. Right now, I think the narrative of compromise as some moral evil, you know, how dare you work with those people, is something that, yeah, the virus kind of just wrecks our presumptions that we could somehow purely work only with those with whom we agree. And right now, unfortunately, the we, they, us, them ends up being so narrowed that we can't think about, no, maybe we need genuine agonistic disagreement. I need conservative neighbors for them to be able to push back on me in important ways. But I've got to see them as capable of pushing back because we, they and I, are joined in some sort of moral commitment that we think continues to propel human life forward.
But you probably have to be willing to get together in relatively small groups with whom you share something in common that is concrete enough that it will transcend those disagreements when you have to agree to disagree, right? And so what is it that you're sort of sharing with these people that allows you to get together in these small groups and remain committed to one another in a pretty fundamental way, despite those disagreements? And I do think there's hope for that. I mean, as we raise our children, we come in contact with a whole lot of people that are really instrumental in helping our children become the people that we want them to be. And we often are on different sides of the political spectrum from them, but we have this shared commitment to this thing, right? Hoping our kids become good people. And then you have a way to come back together after you've disagreed.
It's precisely the leftist thinking that so influences me that actually is the most critical of something like the power play of governmental authoritarianism, right? And so the idea of hating authoritarianism should be what unites the right and the left when it comes to our narrative of democratic life. And yet somehow we've allowed each other to think, no, unless you want to be ruled by their bully, then you've got to lock down with ours. And
so strategy and ideals are taking us in different directions. And sometimes for strategic reasons, we abandon the ideals or the principles which actually underlie our ideology to begin with.
And that's the reflective thinking to which we are called, I think, in philosophy and political theory. And your work, as much as anyone else, I think, in the field right now, is encouraging that sort of thinking. And so, Kim, thank you for being with us. To everyone else, go pick up her book. Again, it's the Experiential Ontology of Hannah Arendt. There are sections that are quite technical, but there's also an enormous amount of it that I think is written in ways to motivate reflective thinking as guided by or driven toward social action. And that's something we all should be invested in. And so thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. This small conversation even, I think, invites me to say, yeah, we don't have to be all in the same room together to be able to think well with others. And so thank you so much for your time being with us today.
Thank you.
And to everyone else, thank you as always for watching. We'll see you next time on Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we always remind each other that philosophy is in the name of the public good, and we've got to do our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. We'll see you next time.